The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. As Thanksgiving approaches, the U.S. and Iran have an historical opportunity to talk Turkey on Iran's nuclear program. A deadline of November 24th has been set for reaching an agreement. An accord on the nuclear portfolio would likely open the door to more substantive discussions of other issues in which the two countries actually share a common interest. Perhaps most notably these days, containment of the so-called Islamic State terrorist group. For an analysis of the U.S.-Iranian diplomatic waltz currently being played out, and some thoughts on where it could lead, we're joined by Joseph Cirincione, president of Ploughshares Fund, a public grant-making foundation focused on nuclear weapons policy and conflict resolution. He is also author of numerous books dealing with policies around weapons of mass destruction, including, most recently, Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late, by Columbia University Press. Well, Joe, welcome back to International Focus.
Thank you very much, Doug. Pleasure to be here.
Well, we've got this 24th of November deadline. Yeah. First of all, whose deadline is it, and what are the things being put under the gun?
This was set by the negotiating parties themselves, and those are the 6 nations known as the P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, United States, Russia, Great Britain, France, and China, plus Germany. And they're all negotiating with Iran to find a way to contain Iran's nuclear program, make sure it's not used to build a bomb, and if they're happy, to then pull back on the sanctions put in place by the United States, United Nations, and Europe.
So what is really has to happen by the 24th then?
That's the deadline, what they call a comprehensive agreement. A year ago, these parties reached an interim agreement. For the first time, that froze Iran's nuclear program. It was a major diplomatic achievement. Iran has been building centrifuges for the last 10 years, since about 2003, during the previous administration. They now have about 10,000 of these machines that can be used to enrich uranium to low levels for fuel or to high levels for a bomb. So, do you trust them? Do you trust that it's just for peaceful purposes? The whole point of these negotiations is no, we don't. We want to find a way to not just freeze the program, which we've done for the last year, but actually roll it back and put it in a system of inspections and monitoring, cameras, seals, inspectors, so that we can be sure it's just for peaceful purposes. If we can put Iran's program in an iron box with a camera on it, then we'll start lifting sanctions.
So as we're sitting here taping this, we're about a month out from that deadline. Where are the two sides?
Real close, closer than we've ever been before. So we are separated by 3 key issues at this point. I'm told that there is a text that has been written. 95% of it is agreed upon. The last 5%, the 3 toughest issues. How many centrifuges? How quickly will the sanctions be released? And how long does this deal last? 5 years? 20 years? Indefinitely? Those are the terms they're trying to hammer out now. If they can do it by the 24th of November, it will be an historic achievement.
And so let's talk a little bit about the impediments on both sides. I'm assuming they're not really technological at this point. They're mostly political. So on the U.S. side, first of all, I mean, what might get in the way?
Yeah, Vali Nasser, who's the dean of Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, has an op-ed this week in the New York Times, and he says it's politics, not national security, that's separating the two sides. The key problem is that for both sides, Iran and the United States, they've got hardliners in their countries that don't want to deal at all. that they benefit from not having a deal. The hardliners in Iran, they'd rather have Iran stay separate from the West. They don't want it to open up. They're afraid that this will be the first step towards reforms in the Iranian society where they would lose power. In the United States, you got a bunch of people who wanted us to invade Iraq to overthrow that regime. They would like us to go to war with Iran to overthrow that regime. So a deal thwarts those purposes. Both presidents have to have a deal that, one, satisfies the core requirements, a contained program and sanctions relief, and number two, is verifiable enough, is good enough that they can bring it back to their publics and win majority support.
Well, to your point, there was a quote fairly recently by Senator McCain who said the only thing worse than military invasion of Iran would be Iran with a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is that
false choice? It's not really a choice. It's not like if we don't bomb Iran, his famous quote, bomb, 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 bomb Iran, if we don't bomb Iran, that somehow they'll get a nuclear weapon. It's not at all clear that Iran actually wants a nuclear weapon. In fact, the National Intelligence Estimate of the United States concludes that Iran has not yet made that decision. Last month in New York, I was actually at dinner with President Hassan Rouhani of Iran. It was a small group, it was an off-the-record discussion, but he made the case to us, former officials, experts, some foundation presidents, that he's made in public, that it's actually not in Iran's interest to get a nuclear weapon. If they get a bomb, then their neighbors will get a bomb. And suddenly Iran's conventional military superiority, it has a big enough force to thwart anybody from invading the country, will be lost. And I think that actually has a certain logic to it. I think Iran wants to get to a certain level, have a certain level of technology, but stop short of a bomb.
Well, there's sort of a shadow party in all of this, and that's Israel,
Yeah.
and particularly as it pertains to the U.S. domestic political scene. So how does that play into it?
Yeah, so Israel is very skeptical. I have relatives in Israel. And when I explained to them what I just explained to you, they said, yeah, we don't trust him. We don't trust him. And that's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's view. No deal is good enough for him. He doesn't want a deal. He would prefer to have a regime that goes on with military threats, economic sanctions, that somehow cripples the regime. But here's the problem. You don't really have that choice. If we don't get an agreement, if these negotiations fall apart, it's not like the United States is then going to attack Iran. I mean, nobody thinks we're going to start another war in the Middle East, not in the cards. Well, what about crippling sanctions? You hear this a lot. Can't we put sanctions on that will crush the Iranian regime? Nope. We already have the toughest sanctions we're ever going to get. International sanctions that has, in fact, hurt the Iranian economy. But the whole point was to get Iran to the table to make a deal. If that deal falls apart, if it doesn't look like we're ever going to have a deal, that sanction regime is going to fall apart. So the alternative to getting an agreement in November, getting a deal now, is either an unconstrained Iranian nuclear program or the fear that Israel will strike Iran to try to stop it, triggering another war in the Middle East. With those alternatives, a deal is far preferable.
Well, and interestingly enough, I think polling in Israel itself suggests that Iran has really sort of fallen down as one of the major concerns of the populace at large, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Here's the other thing you have going for you. It used to be, 3 years ago, front pages of The Atlantic, when will the U.S. attack Iran? All the talk was when we're going to do it. Nobody talks like that now. Nobody really talks seriously about Israel doing that. We've had the Gaza war. We've had the crisis in Iraq. We have U.S. troops leaving Afghanistan. We had the rise of ISIS. There's a whole lot of other more urgent, serious problems than the remote possibility that Iran will somehow, someday get a bomb and attack Israel. So you have the Israeli public now looking at these other threats closer to home. You have Israel's international standing damaged by the Gaza war. You have coalition of nations, including Iran's neighbors, much more concerned with the threat they see from ISIS than the threat they see from Iran. All that is in the mix. All that is driving the countries towards an agreement.
Well, if the hardliners in this country are less concerned about the deal itself and more still harboring regime change.
Yeah, fantasies of regime change, yeah.
What about on the other side? I mean, what are the hardliners concerned about on the Iranian side?
Well, Rouhani has said that there are elements in both countries that profit from the conflict. And in the case of Iran, this is literally true. So Rouhani's considered a pragmatist. I wouldn't call him a moderate, but he's a pragmatist. He still represents a pretty harsh, brutal regime, but he's looking for a way to moderate their policies and come to a deal and to make some reforms that he thinks in the long run will make Iran stronger. But there's the Revolutionary Guard faction, the real hardliners who actually benefit from the sanctions because they control the smuggling operations. So every time a new Porsche appears on the streets of Tehran, some Revolutionary Guard commander is getting a payoff, getting a piece of the action here. So, and they have an ideology that would rather see an autocracy. Rather an autarky. We'd rather see Iran cut off from the West, don't want to be corrupted by the West. So the hardliners, they actually want the conflict to continue. That's the faction that Rouhani's fighting.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the structure of governance in Iran, because I think people oftentimes think, well, here the president is kind of the last word in many ways. Is that the case there? But it's set up a little bit differently in Tehran, isn't it?
It is. The president doesn't actually control national security. He's been given this nuclear negotiation by the supreme leader, the ultimate authority, the Ayatollah Khamenei. So he controls the country. He makes the decision. He runs foreign policy. The president is elected. It is a kind of democracy in Iran, with the candidates in any election all approved by the supreme leader, but then there's choices. And Rouhani's election last year was a surprise. He wasn't supposed to win. He wasn't who the supreme leader was backing, but he won. He's up. There's going to be elections next year, 2015, for the parliament that will again shape the forces in Iran. Rouhani wants to make a deal now in order to relieve the sanctions, in order to improve the economy, so that his pragmatic coalition will do well in those elections.
Well, we got just a few minutes before our break, but without getting too far into inside Iranian baseball, the supreme leader himself ultimately is elected by another body, and the head of that body has just recently passed away.
Yes,
right?
It has. So it's opened up a little bit of a power vacuum. Now that council, as it's called, Council of Guardians, they also get selected next December. So that they will choose the next leader. And that's part of the mix too. And that's the battles that we see so often in domestic politics about Republicans blocking Democrats, Democrats attacking Republicans. It happens in Iran too. It's just a little more obscure, a little odder, but that's the struggle that's going on right now.
So, and Khamenei himself is not exactly hale and hearty. He's not in the best of health, right?
No,
so does that impact the situation at all?
So remember, there's only been two supreme leaders since 1979, and Khamenei is the second. He's elderly. There was a little bit of a rumor scare a little earlier this year where he disappeared from sight for a while. No one knows. I mean, who knows how long they're going to live? So the passing of the supreme leader, that could be a very tumultuous moment in Iranian politics.
So the sooner we can get something inked, then the better. Right?
I would say Rouhani and his foreign minister, Zarif, these are the two best guys we're likely to get under these regimes. They're competent, they're westernized, they understand the West, they want to make a deal. There's no guarantee at all that it'll be easier with the next set of guys that come in. In fact, it'll probably be harder. So if you want a deal, you have a very narrow window for making that deal. I'd say it's in the next couple of months.
Well, let's take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about what the alternative to the deal might be. But first, we'll take a short break.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with Joe Cirincione of the Ploughshares Fund about negotiations with Iran. So, what the negotiations and the tortuous path thereof might beg the question, well, how bad would it be if they did get the bomb? So let's talk a little bit about that.
So suppose all of us are wrong, and suppose some of the conservatives here are right, and Iran is just a chain dog. And if we take the chain of sanctions off, they're going to sprint to a bomb. What happens then? It's highly unlikely that they would actually use the bomb. That would be a suicidal act. That would be the last thing the regime ever did. Israel has about 100 nuclear weapons. The U.S., of course, has about 6,000. So it's very possible that Israel would strike back if attacked by a bomb. Most likely, if those who are in Iran who would favor getting a bomb want it for the same reasons that every other country has wanted it in the last 70 years, security and prestige, that you see the weapon as your protection against attack. Iran, after all, is surrounded by countries with nuclear weapons, Russia, India, Pakistan, China, the U.S., Israel, and so it might see it needs that as a deterrent. It also would be a prestigious element. Here, Iranian technology, we've mastered the atom, and it would put them at an advantage over their peers. But using it would, of course, lose all that. You would, of course, lose the prestige, and of course, you would lose the security. So even if the worst happened, you could contain an Iran with a nuclear weapon the way we've contained other countries with nuclear weapons. It is not the beginning of a nuclear holocaust in the Middle East.
But another thing people point to is, would it be the beginning of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East?
Possibly. So that would definitely, Iran with a nuclear weapon would possibly trigger other countries to get it. And the Iranians talk about this themselves. Why would we do that? Saudi Arabia, could they build a bomb? No. Could they buy a bomb? Maybe from Pakistan, whose nuclear program they helped finance? Maybe. Turkey, could Turkey build a bomb? Yes, it would take them a long time, and if they did, it would violate their agreements under NATO. They're a member of our NATO alliance. It might cost them a rupture with the United States, with the other NATO countries, so they would have a lot to lose. Egypt, they used to have a bomb program in the 70s. They gave it up. Could Egypt build a bomb now? It would be difficult, extremely difficult, especially given the chaotic situation. So theoretically, you could see an expansion of nuclear weapons in the Middle East, but unlikely that any of that would happen very soon.
So, assuming we do manage to get the deal done, you know, I mentioned in the intro, it really could be a gateway issue and fundamentally alter the dynamic between the two countries. So, what are some of the areas where we really do share a strategic interest?
You know, you're not going to be able to get a deal unless it really does stop Iran's program, and the majority of Americans are convinced of that. So that's the number one issue. But after that, a lot of the people in the national security establishment in the United States see a much bigger game and a much bigger gain here in the Middle East. We're never going to be BFFs with Iran. We are going to always have our differences. But if we can manage those differences, we share a number of strategic objectives in common. Both sides want to stabilize Afghanistan, particularly as U.S. troops withdraw. Remember, the U.S. and Iran cooperated in 2001 to overthrow the Taliban. The Taliban is a sworn enemy of the Iranian regime. We both want to stabilize Iraq. This is now a friendly country to Iran. They don't want to see it shattered. We both want to end the civil disorder, the civil war in Syria. We have different sides that we're backing, but we both want to end the conflict. And now, most importantly, we both want to stop ISIS. This is a threat to not just Iraq, not just Syria, but to Iran itself. These guys are enemies of Iran. In fact, there are Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces in Iraq right now fighting and killing ISIS fighters. We're not cooperating with them, but we are communicating with them. Could that turn into the kind of cooperation we had in Afghanistan in 2001? Yes, but only if you have a nuclear deal. Without a nuclear deal, none of this other cooperation is even possible.
And let's shift back domestically for a moment. it seems as if the current Congress is, shall we say, less than enthusiastic for even loosening the sanctions. So the president has the option of waiving them for some brief period of time. Talk a little bit about, first of all, how that works mechanically, and then ultimately how it would play out over the long term.
Well, let me actually do it a little bit differently. You do have ideological opposition in the Congress, where there are people who really are totally against a deal with Iran, don't want it at all. You also have a lot of political opposition. I mean, it's clear that there is an Obama attack machine that thrives on every misstep or any step, actually, the president takes. So whatever he does with Iran, he's going to be attacked, and his opponents are going to use it to show that he's weak, he's dangerous, he's naive, that whole threat image that they've developed about Obama. But in the middle of Congress, there are people who are not convinced that a deal is a good idea, but could be convinced about a deal. What Obama wants to do is buy some time to show those skeptics that a deal works. So the mechanism is this. The president has the authority to waive some of the sanctions we now have in place and to work with the UN Security Council to waive or suspend some of those sanctions that the UN has put in place. You do that, you give it time to see if Iran fulfills its part of the agreement. If it does, then he'll go to Congress in a couple of years and ask Congress to lift the sanctions, which only Congress can do. If Iran doesn't cooperate, the president can end the suspension and snap the sanctions back in place. That's the strategy the administration has. I think that's a pretty compelling strategy. We'll see if it's good enough to convince Congress.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how effective the sanctions have been and how effective they are as an impetus to get a deal on the Iranian side.
The sanctions have been very effective. This is the strongest set of sanctions that have ever been put on any country in peacetime in history. And it's because it's not just the U.S., it's the international aspect that does this. The UN approving sanctions. So even Russia and China going along with this, and then the Europeans adding on. These things have crippled the Iranian economy. Their oil exports have been cut in half. The value of their currency has plummeted. Their foreign reserves are shrinking. And now you have a situation, coincidentally, and as far as I know, nobody's manipulated this, the price of oil is dropping. It used to be 120, it used to be 100. It's down in the low 80s now. That hurts Iran. But all of this is just pressure. The point of the sanctions has been to get Iran to the table. They're at the table. Now you have to get them to make a deal. It's an illusion to think that there's somehow more sanctions would cripple Iran and force them to capitulate. Sanctions have never coerced a country into capitulation. They're only a pressure tool. If Iran's not going to accept a deal that doesn't work for Iran's security interest, Iran is perfectly willing to walk away and suffer the pain and wait out the United States. So it's either deal or we lose. I mean, that's what's at stake here. It's not deal or we get sanctions, bigger sanctions. You don't make this deal, the sanction regime will more or less rapidly disappear.
And how much does just the historical antipathy play into this? I mean, are there people that still have those images of the hostages in their heads and say, under no circumstances are we going to deal with those people?
Oh, it's on both sides. You go to Tehran and there are still posters that say death to America. In fact, Rouhani last year tried to end those chants at the Friday prayer services. Often the crowd breaks up and they go into a chant, death to America. He tried to end that, and the hardliners there, they pushed back and they wanted to keep it. So there's people in Tehran who really do think we're the great Satan and are the cause of all the problems in the Middle East. And on our side, I would say Iran is probably the most demonized country in recent history. I mean, lots of Americans remember those images, and if they've forgotten them, once we get a deal, they're about to see them all over again. So we will be reminded. Now, there's a lot of animosity, adversities, genuine differences to overcome. Many people see the nuclear deal as the first step. It's a stepping stone. Can we do this? Can both sides fulfill the terms of a deal? If so, it builds confidence that you can take some other steps, and so on and so on. I'm convinced that this nuclear deal could be an historic turning point. It could be the beginning of an Iranian-U.S. rapprochement that can fundamentally change the geopolitics of the region to the U.S. advantage.
So we'll send you to the track and ask you to handicap this one. Then, what do you think when we're watching this a month from now? What are we going to see?
Right after the U.S. elections, I think you're going to see the rapid progress in the negotiations. I think we're going to get a deal, at least in principle, by November 24th. I think you may have to extend the negotiations a couple of months to work out the technical details. But when we get that, right before Thanksgiving, that's when all hell breaks loose. That's when the debate over this deal really comes out, and it'll be a full-blown debate in the United States about whether this is good or not. In the end, I think the U.S. national security establishment, current officials, current military, former officials, former military, see the national security benefits of this deal, and are going to back it, and it's going to overcome the hardline extremist elements in Congress.
Well, we'll keep that good thought to our audience. There's one to keep an eye on. Joe Cirincione, thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug.
And viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,